The afternoon sun hung low over the highway, casting amber light across the faded blue exterior of Molly's diner. The small restaurant sat like a lonely sentinel at the edge of town, its neon sign flickering weakly against the gathering dusk. Inside, the clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversation created a familiar rhythm that Grace Mitchell had learned to navigate with practiced efficiency. She wiped down the counter for the third time that hour, her shoulders aching from the double shift. Through the large front window, she could see Ruby sitting at one of the outdoor tables, her small frame hunched over a drawing tongue, poking out in concentration as she gripped a red crayon with fierce determination. 6 years old and already so independent, Grace thought, feeling that familiar mix of pride and guilt that came with single motherhood. Ruby's honey brown ponytail caught the light as she reached for another crayon, completely absorbed in her world of color and imagination. "Order up for table 7, Grace," Molly called from behind the grill, her weathered face creased with the lines of someone who had spent 40 years cooking for truckers and locals alike. "Coming." Grace grabbed the plates, balancing them expertly as she navigated between tables. The lunch rush had finally died down, leaving only a handful of regulars nursing their coffee and pie. Just another hour, she told herself. Just one more hour, and she could take Ruby home, help her with the bath, read her a story, and collapse into bed before starting it all over again tomorrow. But tomorrow was her day off. The thought brought a small smile to her tired face. Tomorrow she could actually be a mother instead of just someone who worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. "Your girl's got quite the imagination," Molly said, following Grace's gaze out the window. "She's been working on that same picture for an hour. She'd draw all day if I let her." Grace set the empty plates in the bin, glancing at the clock. "Thanks again for letting her sit out front while I finish up." "That child is an angel," Molly replied, her gruff voice softening. "Plus she brings some sunshine to this place. Lord knows we could use it." Outside, Ruby carefully selected a blue crayon from her worn box of 24. Her picture was almost complete, a big yellow sun shining down on a small house with 2 stick figures standing in front holding hands. She frowned slightly, studying her work with the critical eye of a young artist. Something was missing. Maybe flowers. She reached for the pink crayon, her small fingers stained with a rainbow of colors. Across the street, in the small park area adjacent to the diner, Wyatt Thorne sat on a wooden bench that seemed too small for his large frame. Despite his imposing presence, broad shoulders stretching the fabric of his black t-shirt, leather vest adorned with patches, arms covered in tattoos that told stories he rarely shared. His expression was gentle as he watched his 4-year-old son navigate the smooth pavement on a bright red scooter. "Look, Daddy, I'm fast," Finn called out, his small legs pushing the scooter in wide circles. His dark hair flopped into his eyes, and his grin was wide enough to show the gap where he'd lost his first tooth last week. "I see you, buddy," Wyatt answered, his deep voice carrying across the quiet space. "Stay where I can see you, okay?" "Okay," Finn nodded enthusiastically, his whole body bobbing with the motion. Wyatt's heart swelled as he watched his son, 4 years old and fearless, just like Harper had been. The thought came unbidden, as it always did, bringing with it the familiar ache that had taken up permanent residence in his chest. Finn reminded him so much of his daughter, the same dark eyes that seemed too old for such a young face, the same laugh that sounded like bells. But where Harper had been cautious, Finn was reckless. Where she had studied the world before acting, Finn dove in head first. 5 years. 5 years since the fire that had taken everything. 5 years since he'd failed to save the 2 people who mattered most. Wyatt pushed the thought away, focusing instead on Finn's joyful face. This was what mattered now. This second chance he'd been given. He wouldn't fail again. Ruby looked up from her drawing when she heard Finn's excited voice. She watched him zoom back and forth on his scooter, a big smile on his face that made her smile too. She didn't know the boy, but he looked like he was having fun. Her eyes drifted to the man on the bench, big and covered in leather, with a serious face that might have scared her, except for something in his eyes. He looked sad, she thought, like the puppy at the shelter Mom had taken her to see last month, the one with the droopy ears who pressed his nose against the glass. Grace appeared at the door carrying a glass of lemonade for Ruby. "How's the masterpiece coming along?" she asked, setting the glass down and brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's forehead with infinite tenderness. "Almost done, Mommy. See, it's us and our house in the sun." Ruby pointed to each element with pride, her finger leaving a small smudge of blue on the paper. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." Grace studied the drawing, seeing the world through her daughter's eyes, simple, bright, full of hope. "I'm almost finished with my shift. Just 20 more minutes, okay?" Ruby nodded, picking up her lemonade with both small hands and taking a long sip that left a faint mustache on her upper lip. Grace planted a quick kiss on her head, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence before hurrying back inside to finish her last tables. Across the street, Finn had grown tired of riding in circles. The slight slope of the park beckoned him toward adventure, toward the place where the pavement tilted gently down toward the road. He didn't think about danger. At 4 years old, danger was an abstract concept that belonged to bedtime stories about monsters, not to sunny afternoons and bright red scooters. Wyatt stood up, stretching his back. Years of riding motorcycles and sleeping on lumpy beds in clubhouses across 3 states had left their mark. "Finn, stay away from the edge, buddy," he called, his voice carrying that note of casual authority that usually worked. Usually. Finn turned at his father's voice, distracted by a butterfly that fluttered past in a blur of orange and black. In that moment of inattention, his foot slipped off the scooter. The small vehicle, now riderless, began to roll slowly down the gentle incline, picking up speed with each rotation of its wheels. "My scooter!" Finn cried, his eyes wide with alarm. Without thinking, he chased after it, his small legs pumping as fast as they could. Wyatt's heart jumped to his throat. Time seemed to shift, moving both too fast and too slow. He saw the scooter accelerating. He saw his son running after it, oblivious to everything except retrieving his beloved toy. He saw the road ahead, cars passing at 40 miles per hour, drivers focused on their destinations and not on small boys chasing scooters. "Finn, stop!" Wyatt shouted, breaking into a run. His boots pounded against the pavement, but the distance seemed impossible. "Not again," his mind screamed. "Please, God, not again." Ruby looked up at the commotion. She saw the little boy running after his scooter, which was rolling faster and faster toward the busy road. She saw the big man running too, but he was too far away. The boy wasn't stopping. He didn't see the danger, he just wanted his toy. Without thinking, without any thought at all, except that someone needed help, Ruby dropped her crayons. The colorful sticks clattered across the table and onto the pavement below, scattering like pickup sticks. Her heart pounded in her chest loud enough that she could hear it in her ears. The little boy was running straight toward danger, and nobody was close enough to help him. Ruby's sneakers slapped against the pavement as she bolted from the table, her ponytail streaming behind her like a banner. "Ruby!" Grace's voice cut through the air, sharp with panic, as she burst through the diner's door. She had glanced out the window just in time to see her daughter darting toward the road, and the world had tilted on its axis. "Ruby, stop." But Ruby didn't hear her mother's cries. Her entire focus was on the little boy chasing the runaway scooter. The distance between the toy and the road was shrinking fast, and the boy showed no signs of stopping. Cars whooshed by on the street drivers, unaware of the unfolding danger, their minds on grocery lists and dinner plans and everything except the small tragedy about to occur. Wyatt sprinted across the grass, his heavy boots pounding the ground. His eyes darted between his son and the approaching road, calculating the distance with growing horror. Mathematics had never been his strong suit, but he didn't need to be good at math to know this equation. Distance plus velocity plus a 4-year-old's determination equaled disaster. He wouldn't make it in time. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. 5 years ago, he hadn't made it in time. He'd been at work responding to a call on the other side of town when the electrical fire started. By the time his unit arrived, the apartment building was engulfed. He'd gone in anyway, breaking protocol, ignoring orders, tearing through smoke and flame to reach the third floor where his family was. He'd found them in the hallway. His wife Elena had been trying to get Harper out, but the smoke had been too thick, the heat too intense. Wyatt had grabbed them both, had tried to carry them out, but a support beam had collapsed. It had caught him across the back, pinning him down. He'd watched helpless as the smoke took them, while he couldn't move, couldn't save them, couldn't do anything except scream their names until his throat was raw. Not again. The thought was a prayer and a curse. Not again. Finn, stop right now, he bellowed, his voice cracking with fear. Finn continued his pursuit, fixated on his beloved scooter. I can get it, Daddy, he called over his shoulder, completely oblivious to the danger ahead. The scooter picked up more speed as it neared the steeper downward slope leading to the road. Ruby ran faster than she'd ever run before. Her ponytail bounced wildly behind her, and her lungs burned with each desperate breath. She was closer to the road than Wyatt was. She was closer to Finn. She could make it. She had to make it. A blue sedan approached from the left, its driver casually tapping the steering wheel to music only they could hear, thinking about the conference call they just left and the report due tomorrow. Not thinking about children, not thinking about scooters, not thinking about tragedy. Grace abandoned her serving tray, sending it clattering to the ground as she burst through the diner's door. Plates shattered on impact, but she didn't hear them. Ruby, she screamed again, her voice raw with terror. She ran toward her daughter, but the distance seemed impossible to cross in time. The whole world had narrowed to a single point, her daughter running toward danger. The scooter hit the road with a small clatter, rolling directly into the path of the oncoming car. Finn followed right behind it, his small arms outstretched, his face set with determination. He was going to get his scooter. Nothing else mattered. Ruby reached him just as he stepped off the curb. Without hesitation, she grabbed Finn around his waist, her momentum carrying them both forward. With all the strength her 6-year-old body could muster, she pushed him away from the road, sending him tumbling onto the grass at the edge of the sidewalk. The boy was safe. The thought was clear and simple in her mind. The boy was safe. Look out, someone shouted from nearby, but the warning came too late. Ruby turned her head toward the sound, just as the blue sedan appeared in her vision, much closer than she'd realized. She could see the driver's face, see the exact moment their eyes widened in shock, see their hands jerk the wheel. The screech of brakes filled the air, a sound that would haunt the dreams of everyone who heard it. Time seemed to slow down the way it does in moments of catastrophe. Ruby stood frozen in the street, her body refusing to move, despite her brain screaming at her to run. Her sneakers felt glued to the asphalt. The car was so close she could see a small crack in the windshield, could read the letters on the license plate. The impact came with a sickening thud that echoed off the buildings. Ruby's small body flew through the air, her arms and legs limp like a rag doll. She landed several feet away, crumpling onto the asphalt in a motionless heap. One of her shoes came off, landing a few feet from her body. Her drawing lay scattered nearby, the happy sun and stick figures seeming obscene against the backdrop of tragedy. "Ruby!" Grace's scream tore through the air as she ran toward her daughter. Her legs felt like lead, each step taking an eternity. The world around her blurred as tears filled her eyes, turning everything into watercolor smears of color and motion. My baby. Someone help my baby. Wyatt stood rooted to the spot, his face drained of all color. Finn was safe, crying but unharmed on the grass where Ruby had pushed him. But the little girl who had saved his son now lay still on the pavement, her colorful t-shirt stark against the black asphalt. A small trickle of blood ran from her forehead, staining her honey-brown hair. In that moment, Wyatt felt as if he were looking at Harper all over again. Another child hurt because he hadn't been fast enough, hadn't been careful enough, hadn't been good enough. The past 5 years collapsed into this single moment, and he was right back in that burning hallway watching someone he should have protected slip away. The driver of the car stumbled out, hands shaking, face contorted with horror. I didn't see her. She came out of nowhere. Oh God, is she okay? Is she okay? Grace fell to her knees beside Ruby, afraid to touch her but desperate to hold her. Ruby, baby, can you hear me? She whispered, her voice breaking. Mommy's here. Please, baby, please. Ruby's eyes remained closed, her chest barely rising with shallow breaths. The small trickle of blood from her forehead was already staining the pavement beneath her head. Her skin looked so pale, almost translucent in the harsh sunlight. People from the diner rushed outside, some calling for ambulances, others standing in shocked silence. A small crowd began to form a circle of witnesses to a mother's worst nightmare. Molly pushed through the crowd, her face ashen, a dish towel still clutched in her hands. Ambulance is on the way, someone said, but the words seemed to come from very far away. Wyatt finally moved, pulling Finn into his arms and holding him tight. The little boy sobbed against his father's chest, not fully understanding what had happened, but sensing the gravity of the moment. Over his son's shoulder, Wyatt's eyes locked onto the scene before him. The desperate mother, the still child, the growing crowd. He had been here before. He knew this moment. He knew how it could break a person forever. The wail of sirens cut through the stunned silence. Red and blue lights flashed across shocked faces as an ambulance screeched to a halt near the accident scene. Two paramedics jumped out, equipment in hand, moving with practiced urgency. Wyatt watched them, remembering a time when he had been one of them, when he had run toward tragedy instead of being paralyzed by it. She just ran out to save the little boy, someone in the crowd explained, voice shaking. She pushed him out of the way. The female paramedic knelt beside Ruby, her hands moving quickly but gently. Ma'am, we need to check her, she said to Grace, her voice firm but kind. Please give us room to work. Grace nodded numbly and shifted back slightly, never taking her eyes off Ruby. Her hands hovered in the air, wanting to touch, to comfort, to fix, but afraid of causing more harm. The paramedics worked quickly, speaking in calm, clipped tones as they assessed her daughter's condition. They carefully secured Ruby's neck with a brace and eased her onto a backboard. Definite head trauma, possible internal injuries, the male paramedic reported into his radio. Pediatric trauma, 6-year-old female unconscious but breathing. BP dropping. We're moving now. Grace's chest tightened with each clinical term. This couldn't be happening. Just minutes ago, Ruby had been coloring happily, her biggest concern, whether to use the blue crayon or the purple one. Now her daughter was being loaded into an ambulance, and words like trauma and unconscious were being used to describe her. Are you her mother? The female paramedic asked. Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. You can ride with us. We're taking her to County General. Wyatt stood nearby, still holding Finn tightly against his chest. The little boy had buried his face in his father's leather vest, sobbing quietly. Wyatt's weathered face was a mask of anguish as he watched the paramedics load Ruby into the ambulance. His hands shook slightly, something that hadn't happened since his first month as a paramedic back when he was 22 and thought he could save everyone. "It's my fault," he said, his deep voice barely audible. "My son, she saved my son." Grace glanced at him, seeing not the intimidating biker she'd often avoided eye contact with at the diner, but a father crushed by guilt. She wanted to say something to blame him, comfort him, or simply acknowledge him, but no words came. Ruby needed her now. Everything else could wait. As the paramedics prepared to close the ambulance doors, Grace climbed inside and sat on the narrow bench. She carefully took Ruby's limp hand, avoiding the IV the paramedics had started. The small fingers were cold, so cold. "We'll be right behind you," Wyatt called out, his voice rough with emotion. "I promise." The doors closed and the ambulance lurched forward, sirens blaring. Inside, the paramedics continued working on Ruby, attaching monitors and speaking in code that Grace didn't understand but terrified her anyway. The beeping of the heart monitor provided a terrifying rhythm to their journey, each beep a reminder that her daughter was alive, but each pause between beeps feeling like an eternity. "Stay with me, baby," Grace whispered, squeezing Ruby's hand. "Please stay with me." Through the back window, she could see a motorcycle following close behind. A small figure clutched safely in front of the rider. Wyatt had kept his word. The trip to the hospital was both endless and too fast. Grace tried to memorize every detail of Ruby's face, as if by doing so she could keep her daughter tethered to this world. The dark lashes resting against pale cheeks, the freckles across her nose that Grace had always lovingly counted, the small scar on her chin from when she'd fallen off her bike last summer. "BP's dropping more," the male paramedic announced, his voice urgent but controlled. "Pulse ox down to 89. "What does that mean?" Grace asked, her voice breaking. "What's happening to her?" "We're doing everything we can, ma'am," the female paramedic replied, not answering the question directly. "We're almost there." The ambulance screeched to a halt at the emergency entrance. The doors flew open, and suddenly there were more hands, more voices. Ruby was whisked away through automatic doors, a team of hospital staff surrounding her small form. 6-year-old female vehicle versus pedestrian. GCS-7 dropping BP, suspected internal bleeding. The information flowed between the paramedics and hospital staff as they ran alongside the stretcher. Grace struggled to keep up, her legs feeling weak beneath her. A nurse tried to direct her to a waiting area, but she pushed past. "I'm her mother," she insisted. "I need to stay with her." "Ma'am, they're taking her straight to surgery," the nurse explained, her voice firm but kind. "The surgical team is waiting. The best thing you can do for your daughter now is let them work." At the entrance to a set of double doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only," the stretcher paused briefly. A doctor in surgical scrubs leaned over Ruby, checking her pupils with a pen light. His face was impassive, professional, giving nothing away. "Ruby," Grace called, her voice breaking. "Mommy's here. You're going to be okay?" For just a moment, Grace thought she saw Ruby's fingers twitch. Or maybe it was just wishful thinking, her mind creating movement where there was none, because the alternative was unbearable. Then the stretcher was moving again, disappearing through the doors. A nurse gently but firmly held Grace back. "The surgical team will take good care of her," she promised. "There's a waiting area right here. The doctor will come talk to you as soon as they know more." Left alone in the sterile hallway, Grace pressed her back against the wall and slowly slid down until she was sitting on the cold floor. Her entire body trembled uncontrollably. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the pieces together as sobs racked her body. The hallway light seemed too bright, the antiseptic smell too sharp. Everything about this place screamed that something was terribly wrong with her perfect, beautiful little girl, and there was absolutely nothing Grace could do to fix it. A shadow fell across her. Grace looked up to see Wyatt standing there, Finn still in his arms. The little boy had finally cried himself to sleep, his face puffy and tear-stained. Wyatt's own face was a landscape of grief and guilt. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry." Grace stared at him, this stranger whose son was safe because her daughter was in surgery. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to blame him. She wanted someone, anyone, to be responsible for this nightmare. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was, she just ran. She didn't even think about it. "She saved him," Wyatt said, and there was something broken in his voice that made Grace look at him more closely. "Your daughter saved my son's life." They stood like that for a long moment, two parents on opposite sides of an impossible situation. Then Wyatt carefully lowered himself to sit on the floor beside Grace, keeping a respectful distance. Finn stirred in his arms but didn't wake. "5 years ago, I lost my daughter," Wyatt said suddenly, staring at the opposite wall. "And my wife. There was a fire. I was a paramedic then, working a night shift. By the time I got there..." He trailed off, swallowing hard. "I tried to get them out. I tried, but I couldn't. I failed them." Grace turned to look at him, seeing the raw pain in his eyes. "When I saw your daughter lying on that road," Wyatt continued, "it was like looking at Harper all over again. Another child hurt because I wasn't fast enough." He finally met Grace's eyes. "But she's alive. Your girl is alive. And I swear to you, I will do everything in my power to help her stay that way." Before Grace could respond, footsteps echoed down the hallway. They both looked up to see several more motorcycles pulling into the parking lot outside, visible through the large windows. Men in leather vests were dismounting their bikes, heading toward the hospital entrance. "My brothers," Wyatt explained, seeing Grace's questioning look. "They'll want to help." One by one, they filed into the waiting area. Big men with weathered faces and intimidating appearances, but each of them approached Grace with unexpected gentleness, offering quiet words of support. A man with a gray beard introduced himself as Vince. Another, younger with sharp eyes, was Dex. There was Tommy, Bones, Ricky, names that blurred together in Grace's exhausted mind. "We're here if you need anything," Vince said, his gruff voice surprisingly kind. "Coffee, food, someone to call, anything." Grace nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. She didn't know these men. She'd seen them occasionally at the diner, had served them coffee and pie, but they were strangers. Yet here they were, keeping vigil with her in her darkest hour. The hours crawled by. The waiting room clock ticked past midnight, each second stretching like taffy. Grace sat hunched forward in an uncomfortable plastic chair, elbows on her knees, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her eyes were fixed on the swinging doors that separated her from Ruby. Every time they opened, her heart leapt with hope, only to crash again when it wasn't the surgeon with news about her daughter. The bikers had spread out across the waiting area, some dozing in chairs, others standing near the windows, but all of them maintaining their vigil. Wyatt had given Finn to Vince, who had taken the sleeping child to a quieter corner. Now Wyatt sat across from Grace, elbows on his knees, mirroring her posture. Neither of them had spoken in over an hour. A nurse stopped by periodically with updates that weren't really updates. "She's still in surgery. The doctors are doing everything they can. It takes time." Each phrase was meant to be comforting, but only served to heighten Grace's anxiety. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doors swung open and a surgeon in blue scrubs walked toward them. The name on her badge read Dr. Rebecca Morrison. Grace stood so quickly her vision blurred, and she felt Wyatt's steadying hand at her elbow. Ms. Mitchell. Dr. Morrison extended her hand, her grip firm and warm. Yes, Grace managed her throat dry. How is she? Is she? Ruby's out of surgery, Dr. Morrison said, and Grace felt her knees weaken with relief. Wyatt's grip on her elbow tightened, keeping her upright. She's stable. The word stable seemed to echo in the waiting room. Grace heard someone behind her let out a long breath. The internal bleeding was significant, Dr. Morrison continued. Contained primarily to her spleen. We were able to repair the damage without removing it, which is very good news. Her body will need the spleen, especially as she grows. Her head, Grace managed. There was so much blood. She has a moderate concussion and required stitches for the laceration on her forehead, but the CT scan shows no severe brain injury, no skull fracture, no significant swelling. These are all very positive signs. And her leg, Grace asked, remembering the unnatural angle of Ruby's right leg. Broken tibia. We've set it and put it in a cast. It's a clean break, which means it should heal well with time and proper care. Dr. Morrison's expression softened. Ms. Mitchell, your daughter is young and otherwise healthy. These are significant positive factors for recovery. She's not out of the woods yet, but I'm cautiously optimistic. Grace pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears flowing freely now. Behind her, she heard the bikers murmuring among themselves. Heard Vince say quietly, "Thank God." When can I see her? Grace asked. She's in recovery now, Dr. Morrison replied. As soon as she's settled in the pediatric ICU, a nurse will take you to her. It shouldn't be more than 30 minutes. Thank you. Grace whispered the words utterly inadequate for the gift this woman had given her. Thank you for saving my little girl. As Dr. Morrison walked away, Grace found herself turning toward Wyatt. Without thinking, she reached for his hand and squeezed it tightly. His rough palm against hers felt like an anchor in the storm that had been the last few hours. She's going to be okay, Grace said, her voice breaking on a sob that was half joy, half lingering fear. Wyatt nodded, and for the first time since the accident, a tear broke free to trail down his weathered cheek. She's going to be okay, he repeated, as if saying the words aloud might help him believe them. Around them, the bikers embraced, clapping each other on the back. Vince wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, not bothering to hide his emotion. Dex called someone on his phone, probably spreading the good news to other members of the club who hadn't been able to come. Grace sank back into her chair, still holding Wyatt's hand. She was exhausted beyond measure, wrung out emotionally and physically, but Ruby was alive. Her daughter was alive and stable and going to be okay. For now, that was enough. That was everything. Morning light filtered through the thin hospital curtains, casting a pale golden glow across Ruby's small form in the pediatric ICU bed. Machines beeped softly beside her, monitoring her vital signs with steady precision. An IV dripped clear fluid into her arm, and the oxygen monitor clipped to her finger glowed red in the dim light. Grace had spent the night in an uncomfortable armchair pulled close to Ruby's bedside, her hand never leaving her daughter's, except when the nurses came to check vitals or adjust medications. She had dozed fitfully, jerking awake every time a monitor beeped differently or Ruby made any sound. Now in the early morning light, she watched her daughter's face for any sign of consciousness. Ruby's breathing was steady, if shallow. The bandage on her forehead stood out starkly white against her pale skin. Her right leg, encased in a cast, was elevated slightly on pillows. Grace had counted Ruby's breaths during the night. 1,347 breaths between midnight and dawn, each one a small miracle. Ruby's eyelids fluttered. Grace leaned forward instantly, her heart racing. "Ruby," she whispered, "baby, can you hear me?" Slowly, so slowly it seemed to take forever. Ruby's eyes opened. For a moment, confusion clouded her expression as she took in the unfamiliar ceiling tiles, the antiseptic smell, the beeping machines. Her gaze wandered, trying to make sense of her surroundings. "Mommy!" Her voice was barely above a whisper, rough from the breathing tube that had been removed after surgery. Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'm right here, baby. I'm right here." She brushed a strand of hair from Ruby's forehead, careful to avoid the bandage. Ruby tried to move, then winced. "It hurts." "I know, sweetheart." Grace pressed the call button to alert the nurse. "Try not to move too much, okay? You got hurt yesterday, but you're in the hospital now, and the doctors are taking very good care of you." Ruby's brow furrowed as fragments of memory began to surface. "The little boy," she said suddenly, her eyes widening. "The one who was running. Is he okay?" Grace felt a lump form in her throat. Of course, Ruby's first concern would be for someone else. "He's fine, baby. You saved him." "What happened?" Ruby asked, looking down at the cast on her leg with wide eyes. "Why am I here?" Grace took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. She had thought about this moment all night, wondering how to explain to a 6-year-old that her act of heroism had nearly cost her life. "You were very brave yesterday," Grace began. "There was a little boy chasing his scooter, and it was heading toward the road where the cars were. You ran really fast and pushed him out of the way so he wouldn't get hurt." Ruby nodded slowly, processing this information. "I remember running. I was scared the car would hit him." "Instead, it hit you," Grace said softly, her voice catching. "You have a broken leg, and the doctors had to fix some things inside your tummy. That's why it hurts. But you're going to get better, sweetheart. The doctors promise you're going to be just fine." A nurse entered, bringing a cup of ice chips and a warm smile. "Look who's awake. How are you feeling, brave girl?" "Sore," Ruby admitted, her voice small. "That's completely normal," the nurse said kindly, checking the monitors. "We'll get you something for the pain in just a minute." She adjusted Ruby's blankets with gentle hands. "Your mom hasn't left your side for 1 second, you know. And there's been quite a parade of people asking about you." Ruby looked at her mother questioningly. "The whole diner staff sent flowers," Grace explained, gesturing to a cheerful bouquet on the windowsill. "And Mrs. Perez from next door brought your favorite teddy bear from home." She placed the worn stuffed animal beside Ruby, who hugged it with her free arm. After the nurse administered pain medication and left, Ruby asked, "The little boy, what's his name?" "Finn," Grace replied. "Finn Thorne. Does he know I'm okay?" Grace nodded, thinking of Wyatt's pale face in the waiting room, the way he'd broken down when Dr. Morrison gave them the good news. "His dad has been calling to check on you." In fact, she hesitated. "They might come visit you today if you're feeling up to it." Ruby's face brightened despite the pain. "I'd like that. I want to make sure he's really okay." An hour later, after Ruby had managed a few spoonfuls of applesauce and some juice, there was a soft knock at the door. Grace looked up to see Wyatt standing in the doorway, looking somehow even larger in the confines of the hospital room. Finn was partially hidden behind his legs, peering around his father's denim-clad thigh. In Wyatt's hands was a small, potted plant with cheerful yellow daisies. "Is it okay if we come in?" Wyatt asked, his voice gentler than Grace had ever heard it. "Of course," Grace said, standing to make room. She looked down at Ruby. "Ruby, this is Mr. Thorne and his son Finn." Wyatt approached the bed carefully, as if afraid his large presence might somehow disturb the healing taking place. Hello, Ruby. These are for you. He placed the plant on the bedside table. Daisies. They're tough flowers. They always find a way to grow back no matter what. Ruby smiled at him. Thank you. They're pretty. Finn, still partially hiding behind his father, peered up at Ruby with wide-eyed solemn eyes. Wyatt knelt down beside him and whispered something in his ear. Finn nodded and stepping forward, extending a crumpled piece of paper toward Ruby. I made this for you, he said, his voice small but determined. It's a thank you drawing. Grace helped Ruby take the paper, holding it where she could see. On it was a child's drawing of two stick figures, one small with spiky yellow hair, the other a bit bigger with long brown hair. They were holding hands, and above them was a bright sun with a smiley face. Written across the top in wobbly letters that Wyatt had clearly helped with were the words, "Thank you, brave girl." Ruby's eyes lit up. I love it. Did you draw the sun with the smiley face? Finn nodded, moving closer to the bed. And that's me. He pointed to the smaller figure. And that's you. It's the best drawing I've ever gotten, Ruby said sincerely. Can my mom put it right here so I can see it? She pointed to the wall beside her bed where she could view it easily. As Grace carefully taped the drawing to the wall, Ruby looked at Finn and patted the edge of her bed. Want to see my cast? The doctor said people can sign it when it's not so new anymore. Finn climbed onto the chair beside the bed, his shyness melting away as he examined the white plaster with fascination. Does it hurt? A little, Ruby admitted, but the medicine helps. The doctor says I was really brave. You are brave, Finn said with absolute conviction. You saved me. Wyatt watched this exchange, his throat tight with emotion. This little girl lying in a hospital bed with a broken leg and stitches in her forehead was more concerned about whether Finn was okay than about her own pain. She reminded him so much of Harper, not just in appearance, though there were similarities, but in spirit. Harper had been like that too, always thinking of others first. Ruby, Wyatt said, his voice rough, I don't know how to properly thank you for what you did. You saved my son's life. If there's anything at all that you need, you just say the word. Ruby considered this seriously. Can you tell me a story? My mom tells me stories, but she's really tired. Wyatt felt something in his chest crack open. Yeah, he managed. Yeah, I can tell you a story. He pulled a chair close to Ruby's bed and began to spin a tale about a brave princess who lived in a castle made of clouds. Finn settled in beside him, occasionally adding his own details to the story. Grace watched from her chair, seeing a side of this intimidating biker that she never would have imagined existed. When visiting hours ended, Wyatt and Finn prepared to leave. At the door, Wyatt turned back. We'll come back tomorrow if that's okay, he said to Grace. Please do, Ruby called out before Grace could answer. I want to hear what happens to the Cloud Princess. After they left, Grace pulled her chair close to Ruby's bed again. What do you think of Mr. Thorne? She asked curiously. Ruby was quiet for a moment, her small face thoughtful. He has sad eyes, she finally said, like he's lost something important, but he tells good stories. Grace looked at her daughter with wonder. How did a 6-year-old see so clearly what adults work so hard to hide? That evening, after Ruby had drifted off to sleep again, Grace stepped into the hallway where Nurse Patty was checking charts at the station. Your little girl is quite the fighter, Patty said with a smile. Her vitals are looking great. Has anyone else come by while I was dozing? Grace asked. Patty's expression softened. Just Wyatt. He stopped by about an hour ago but didn't want to wake Ruby. He left this. She handed Grace a paper bag. Inside, Grace found a container of homemade soup still warm, a chunk of crusty bread, and a slice of apple pie. A note written in surprisingly neat handwriting read, Thought you might be hungry. Grace felt tears prick her eyes for what felt like the 100th time that day. This man, this stranger who belonged to a world she knew nothing about, was showing her and her daughter a kindness that seemed almost incomprehensible. "He's a good man, you know," Patty said quietly, "despite what people might say. You know him. Used to work with him years back before he joined the club." Patty closed the chart she was holding. "He was one of the best paramedics I've ever seen. Could stay calm in any situation, had a gift for making patients feel safe even when things were falling apart." "What happened?" Grace asked. "Why did he leave?" Patty's face grew sad. "He lost his little girl. She was about Ruby's age. There was a fire, his wife and daughter both. Wyatt tried to save them, went into the building, even though it was against protocol. A beam came down on him, pinned him. He had to watch." She trailed off, shaking her head. "He couldn't stay after that. The pain was too much. Every call with a child, every family in crisis, it all reminded him of what he'd lost." Grace thought about Wyatt's face when he'd first arrived at the hospital, the way he'd looked at Ruby lying on the road. "He said she reminded him of his daughter." Patty nodded. "Harper, sweet little thing. I think that's why Ruby means so much to him. It's not charity or pity. It's," she searched for the right word, "recognition. He sees in Ruby a chance to do what he couldn't do before." Grace returned to Ruby's room, the soup warm in her hands, her mind full of new understanding. She settled back into her chair and ate slowly, watching her daughter sleep peacefully. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, insurance forms to fill out, medical bills to figure out, recovery plans to discuss. But tonight, Ruby was alive and healing, and that was all that mattered. Outside the hospital window, Grace saw a motorcycle pull into the parking lot. Wyatt dismounted, looked up at the pediatric wing, then got back on his bike and rode away. Keeping watch, Grace realized. He was keeping watch over them. For the first time since the accident, Grace felt something other than fear and exhaustion. She felt not quite safe, but protected. And in her world, a world where she'd been alone for so long, carrying every burden by herself, that was a gift beyond measure. 3 days had passed since Ruby had opened her eyes, and the rhythm of hospital life had become almost familiar. Morning vitals at 6, breakfast at 7:30, physical therapy at 10, lunch at noon, afternoon rest, dinner at 5, evening visitors until 8. Grace had memorized the schedule, lived by it, found strange comfort in its predictability. Wyatt came every day at 3 o'clock, like clockwork. Sometimes he brought Finn, sometimes he came alone, but he always brought stories. Stories about cloud princesses and motorcycle riding bears, and dragons who were afraid of butterflies. Ruby would listen with rapt attention, her pain seeming to ease while Wyatt's deep voice filled the room with tales of impossible adventures. On the 4th day, Grace noticed something unusual when she went home to shower and change clothes. Her front porch step, the one that had been cracked and dangerous for months, had been replaced. Fresh wood, properly treated, securely fastened. She stood staring at it, remembering how she'd meant to fix it but never had the time or money. Now it was done, and she had no idea when or by whom. Inside, her refrigerator was stocked with groceries. Fresh milk, eggs, bread, fruit, vegetables. Containers of prepared meals lined the shelves. Grace opened the freezer to find it equally well stocked. Someone had been in her house. Someone had helped her. She thought of the motorcycles she'd seen in the hospital parking lot, thought of Vince and Dex and the other men who'd kept vigil that first terrible night. But why would they do this? They didn't know her. They barely knew Ruby. When she returned to the hospital, Grace found Wyatt sitting beside Ruby's bed, reading from a children's book. Finn was curled up in the chair by the window, fast asleep, clutching a small dinosaur. Ruby's eyes were drooping, but she was fighting to stay awake to hear the end of the story. Grace waited until Ruby finally drifted off before speaking. "Can I talk to you?" she asked Wyatt quietly. "Outside." They stepped into the hallway and Grace crossed her arms, trying to appear more confident than she felt. "My porch step was fixed, and someone left groceries in my house." Wyatt's expression didn't change. "That's so. Was it you, your friends?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Might have mentioned to some of the brothers that your place needed a few repairs." "Wyatt, I can't accept." "Nobody's asking you to accept anything," he interrupted gently. "Sometimes things just get done. No strings, no debts, no expectations." "But why?" Grace's voice cracked slightly. "Why would you do this for strangers?" Wyatt looked through the window at Ruby sleeping peacefully. "Your daughter didn't think twice before saving Finn. She didn't ask who his daddy was or what club he belonged to. She just saw someone who needed help and she helped." He turned back to Grace. "Sometimes it's just that simple." Before Grace could respond, her phone buzzed. A text from the hospital billing department. "Please stop by when convenient to discuss payment arrangements." Grace's stomach dropped. She'd been trying not to think about the money, about the mounting bills that would bury her for years. Emergency room, ambulance, surgery, ICU, physical therapy. The numbers must be astronomical by now. "I have to go," she said quickly, not wanting Wyatt to see the panic in her eyes. The next morning, Grace sat across from a woman named Patricia Wilson in the hospital's financial services office. Her folder of paperwork felt pitifully thin, pay stubs showing barely enough to live on, insurance documents that covered almost nothing, bank statements revealing a checking account balance of $237. "I know it looks bad," Grace began, "but I can make payments. It might take a while, but I always pay my debts. I just need to know what we're looking at." Patricia typed on her computer, her brow furrowing. "That's strange," she murmured. Grace's heart sank. "Is there a problem? Did insurance deny everything?" "Actually, Ms. Mitchell, I'm showing that Ruby's account has been paid in full." The words didn't make sense at first. Grace shook her head. "That's impossible. I haven't paid anything yet except the initial emergency room copay." "Let me double check." Patricia clicked through several screens, her confusion growing. "Yes, according to our records, all charges have been paid. The emergency services, surgery, hospital stay, medications, physical therapy sessions, everything." Grace felt lightheaded. There must be some mistake. Who would have... She stopped, a thought forming in her mind. Patricia turned her monitor so Grace could see. "The payment was processed 3 days ago. It's marked as an anonymous donation." "Anonymous," Grace repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "How much are we talking about?" Patricia hesitated, then said quietly, $187,412. The number was incomprehensible. Grace stared at the screen where it showed a zero balance, unable to process what she was seeing. That kind of money, she would never have been able to pay it back. It would have followed her for the rest of her life. "Is there any way to find out who did this?" Grace asked, her hands trembling. "The donor specifically requested anonymity. All I can tell you is that it was paid in cash." Grace thought of the men in leather vests, the ones who looked like they belonged in a different world. The ones who'd fixed her porch and filled her refrigerator. The ones who came to the hospital every day to check on a little girl they barely knew. She left the office in a daze. The weight that had been crushing her for days had suddenly lifted, leaving her dizzy with relief and confusion. Who would do this? And why? Grace found herself driving not back to the hospital, but to an auto garage on the east side of town. She'd seen the address on a receipt that had fallen from Wyatt's pocket, Miller's Auto Shop. As she pulled up, she saw several motorcycles parked outside, gleaming in the afternoon sun. Inside, the shop smelled of oil and metal. Three men looked up from their work. Vince Dex and another man she didn't recognize. They exchanged glances. "Mrs. Mitchell," Vince said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Everything okay with Ruby?" "She's fine," Grace said. "I need to know something. The hospital bills, they've been paid." "All of them." "Was it you, the club?" Vince's expression didn't change. "Ma'am, sometimes things happen that don't need explaining." "Please," Grace said, and she heard her voice break. "I need to know." The men looked at each other. Finally, Dex spoke up. "We got a fund for emergencies. Brothers contribute what they can." "But it was almost $200,000, Grace said, her voice rising. "That's not just contributions." Vince sighed deeply. "Some of the boys sold things, bikes, parts, tools. Dex there sold his truck." He paused. "And Wyatt? What about Wyatt?" "He was supposed to have surgery next month. Nothing life-threatening, just an old back injury from the fire that gives him trouble. He's been saving up for years to get it fixed. Got his deposit back from the surgeon." Vince met Grace's eyes. Sometimes people need help more than they need fixing. Grace felt her knees weaken. She steadied herself against a nearby workbench. "Why would you all do this? You barely know us." Vince stepped closer, his weathered face kind despite its rough appearance. "Your little girl didn't think twice before saving Finn. She didn't ask what she'd get in return or whether it was worth the risk. She just did what was right." He shrugged. "Sometimes it's just that simple." The same words Wyatt had used. Grace stood there surrounded by these men whose society had taught her to fear and felt tears streaming down her face. All those years of struggling alone, of having to be strong for Ruby, of facing each challenge by herself. And now these strangers, these supposed criminals, these dangerous bikers had shown more kindness than she'd experienced in years. "I don't know what to say," she finally managed. "You don't have to say anything," Vince replied. "Ruby's what matters. She's going to be okay now, right?" Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. That evening, she sat in the hospital room watching Ruby sleep. The little girl had made progress today, had sat up without help, had eaten half of her dinner, had laughed at one of Wyatt's stories about Buddy the bear. But Grace couldn't stop thinking about what the bikers had done, about Wyatt canceling his surgery, about men selling their possessions for a child they'd never met. She was still sitting there when her phone rang. Molly's name appeared on the screen. "Grace, honey, you need to come to the town meeting tonight," Molly said without preamble. "I can't leave Ruby. It's about those bikers, the ones who've been hanging around you and Ruby. Grace, people are worried. Mayor Wilson called a special session. I think you should be there." Grace's stomach clenched. "What kind of meeting?" "Just come if you can. I'll sit with Ruby." An hour later, Grace walked into the community center to find it packed. 200 people, at least more than she'd ever seen at a town gathering. The air hummed with tension. She slipped into a seat near the back, trying to be inconspicuous, but heads turned. Whispers started. Mayor Wilson called the meeting to order, his round face unusually serious. "Folks I know are all concerned about the increasing presence of the motorcycle club in our town, particularly their involvement with the Mitchell family following the accident." Grace's face flushed hot. She hadn't expected to be the topic of conversation. Frank Barton, who owned the hardware store, stood up. "My wife saw 3 of them bringing groceries to Grace's house. What are they after? These gangs don't do charity without wanting something in return." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. They fixed her roof too, someone added. Makes you wonder what they're expecting. Grace's hands tightened in her lap. The kindness she'd discovered was being twisted into something sinister. Mrs. Henderson stood next. I've read about these motorcycle clubs. They're involved in all sorts of illegal activities. Do we want that influence around our children? Around poor little Ruby. More nodding, more concerned glances in Grace's direction. I heard Wyatt Thorne was kicked out of his paramedic job, another voice called out. Can't trust a man like that. Grace felt her breath catch. That wasn't true. Wyatt had left because the pain of losing his family had been too much. But how could she explain that without betraying his confidence? Principal Davis stood adjusting his glasses. I think we need to consider the safety of all our children. These men have criminal records. Not all of them, Grace found herself saying. The words came out before she could stop them. The room went quiet as everyone turned to look at her. Mayor Wilson seemed uncomfortable. Grace, we understand you're grateful because of what happened with Ruby. But these men may be using your situation. They saved us, Grace interrupted, standing up. Her voice was stronger now. They paid Ruby's hospital bills. All of them. $187,000. Shocked silence. They did it anonymously, Grace continued. They didn't want credit or thanks. Wyatt Thorne canceled his own surgery to help pay for it. They're not using us. They're helping us when no one else did. Frank Barton shook his head. Grace, you don't understand how these gangs operate. They're dangerous men. Dangerous? Grace felt anger rising in her chest. You know what's dangerous? My daughter lying on that road bleeding. You know who was there, Wyatt Thorne. You know who kept vigil at the hospital all night. Those dangerous men. Where was everyone else? Sheriff Parker stood up, his uniform crisp and authoritative. I understand emotions are running high, but I've dealt with these clubs before. This is how they work their way into communities. They find vulnerable situations and exploit them. He turned to address the whole room. I've looked into their backgrounds. Several of them have records of assault, disturbing the peace, property damage. And now they're hanging around a single mother and her injured child. I think we need to take action. What kind of action? Someone asked. I'm prepared to open an investigation into potential extortion and child endangerment, Sheriff Parker said. And if Ms. Mitchell continues to allow these men around her daughter, I'll have no choice but to contact Child Protective Services. The words hit Grace like a physical blow. CPS. They could take Ruby away. Grace, Mrs. Henderson said gently, using her first name like they were friends instead of mere acquaintances. Think about what's best for Ruby. What happens when she recovers and they're still hanging around? What kind of influence will that be? What kind of danger? The room seemed to close in around Grace. Faces that had been familiar her whole life now looked at her with pity and concern and judgment. These were people who'd known her since she was a child, who'd watched her struggle as a single mother, who'd offered sympathetic smiles but never real help. And now they were telling her to turn away the only people who had. I appreciate everyone's concern, Grace said, her voice shaking but determined. But Wyatt and his friends have never asked me for anything. They've never made me feel unsafe. They make Ruby smile, which is more than I can say for most people in this room. But even as she said the words, doubt crept in. What if they were right? What if she was putting Ruby at risk? The threat of CPS hung over her head like a guillotine. She couldn't lose her daughter. She couldn't. Grace left the meeting before it ended, unable to bear the weight of all those eyes on her. She drove back to the hospital in a daze, the sheriff's words echoing in her mind. Child endangerment. investigation, CPS. When she arrived at Ruby's room, she found Wyatt there reading to Ruby from a book about dinosaurs. Finn was asleep in the corner chair again. Ruby's face was bright with interest, her pain temporarily forgotten as Wyatt made silly voices for the different dinosaurs. They both looked up when Grace entered. Wyatt must have seen something in her face because his expression immediately changed to concern. "Ruby, honey, would you mind if I talked to Mr. Thorne in the hallway for a minute?" Grace asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Ruby nodded, yawning. The pain medication was making her drowsy again. In the hallway, Grace found she couldn't meet Wyatt's eyes. "There was a town meeting tonight," she began. "I know," Wyatt said quietly. "Vince called me. They're talking about opening an investigation about CPS." Grace's voice broke. "Wyatt, I can't lose her. I can't risk losing Ruby." Understanding dawned on Wyatt's face, followed quickly by resignation. "You need me to stay away." "I'm sorry," Grace whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. You've been so kind to us. You've done so much, but I can't. If there's even a chance they could take her from me." Wyatt nodded slowly. "I understand. Ruby comes first, always." He glanced back toward the room where Ruby was visible through the window, already drifting to sleep. "Will you tell her? Will you tell her I said goodbye?" "Please don't make this harder," Grace said. "You're doing what you think is right," Wyatt said, and there was no anger in his voice, only sadness. "I'd do the same thing in your position. I did do the same thing once, tried to protect someone I loved. Didn't work out the way I planned, but I understand the impulse." He started to walk away, then turned back. "Grace, for what it's worth, I think your daughter is one of the bravest people I've ever met. It's been an honor knowing her." Grace watched him disappear down the hallway, his broad shoulders seeming to carry an impossible weight. She heard the rumble of his motorcycle starting up in the parking lot, fading into the distance. Then she went back into Ruby's room, sat in her chair, and cried silently while her daughter slept. The next morning, Ruby woke early. Her first words were, "Is Mr. Wyatt coming today?" Grace's heart broke. "Not today, sweetie. Tomorrow." "I don't think so, baby." Ruby's face fell. "But he didn't finish the story about the dinosaur who was afraid of butterflies." "I'm sure he had to go help someone else," Grace said, hating herself for the lie. As the day progressed, Ruby asked about Wyatt 3 more times. Each time Grace deflected with vague answers. By afternoon, Ruby had stopped asking, but her eyes kept drifting to the door, waiting for someone who wouldn't come. The physical therapist arrived at 2 o'clock. "Ready to try some steps today, Ruby?" she asked cheerfully. Ruby shook her head. "I'm tired. Just a few steps. You did so well yesterday." "I don't want to." The therapist looked at Grace with concern. "Is she feeling okay?" "Pain levels up." "She's just having an off day," Grace said, but worry gnawed at her. By the second day without Wyatt, the change in Ruby was unmistakable. She picked at her food, barely eating. She didn't want to draw or color. When the physical therapist came, Ruby went through the motions mechanically without the determination she'd shown before. There were no jokes, no stories about what she'd do when she could walk again. Dr. Bennett frowned when he came for evening rounds. "Her pain levels are up today," he noted, looking at the chart, "and her appetite is down. Any idea why?" "Me?" Grace shook her head, unable to admit that she'd taken away the one thing that had been helping her daughter heal. On the third day, Ruby barely spoke. She stared out the window, clutching Buddy the bear, the gift Wyatt had brought that first day, and occasionally a tear would roll down her cheek. "Ruby, honey, talk to me," Grace pleaded. "Does something hurt?" Why doesn't Mr. Wyatt want to see me anymore? Ruby asked, her voice small and broken. Grace felt like someone had reached into her chest and squeezed her heart. Oh, baby, it's not that he doesn't want to. Did I do something wrong? No, no, sweetheart, you didn't do anything wrong. Then why did he leave? Ruby's eyes were filled with tears. I thought we were friends. Grace had no answer. How could she explain adult fears and town politics and the threat of CP to a 6-year-old? How could she make Ruby understand that sometimes love meant making impossible choices? That night, after Ruby had cried herself to sleep, Nurse Patty stopped by Grace's chair. Whatever's going on, Patty said quietly, you need to figure it out. Ruby's recovery is stalling. Her vitals are declining. This isn't just physical anymore. Grace knew. She could see it every time she looked at her daughter. Ruby was fading before her eyes, and Grace had done this. In trying to protect her daughter, she was destroying her. On the fourth day, Ruby was scheduled for a crucial physical therapy session. Dr. Bennett wanted to see if she could stand with minimal support, but when the time came, Ruby refused. I can't, she said, tears streaming down her face. It hurts too much. The pain medication should be helping, the therapist said, concerned. It's not my leg that hurts, Ruby whispered so quietly Grace almost didn't hear. That evening, Grace sat beside Ruby's bed, watching her daughter sleep fitfully. She thought about the town meeting, about Sheriff Parker's threats, about the fear in the eyes of people who'd known her all her life. Then she thought about Wyatt's face when he'd said goodbye, about the bikers keeping vigil at the hospital, about the zero balance on Ruby's medical bills. She thought about men selling their possessions for a child they'd never met, about Wyatt canceling his surgery, about the way Ruby's face lit up when he walked into the room, about the stories that made her daughter laugh. Through pain. Mom, Ruby's voice was small in the darkness. Are you awake? I'm here, baby. I've been thinking about something, Ruby said slowly. When I saw Finn about to get hurt, I didn't think about it. I just did it. I know, sweetheart. And Mr. Wyatt said I didn't let Finn fall. Ruby turned to look at her mother, and in the dim light from the monitors, her eyes seemed older than 6 years. So we shouldn't let Mr. Wyatt fall either. Grace felt something crack inside her chest. What do you mean? Mr. Wyatt is sad now. He's falling inside. Ruby placed a small hand over her heart. He already lost his little girl, and now he lost me too. Out of the mouths of babes. Grace's own mother used to say that. Children seeing truth that adults work so hard to hide. He told me about his daughter, Ruby continued. Her name was Harper. He said I remind him of her. That's why he likes to read to me. She clutched Buddy tighter. He said sometimes people look scary on the outside when they're just sitting on the inside. Grace thought about the town's reaction, the fear and judgment in their eyes. Then she thought about Wyatt sitting beside Ruby's bed making dinosaur voices, about Vince and Dex fixing her house in the middle of the night, about men who looked dangerous but acted with a kindness that put her whole community to shame. You're right, Ruby, Grace said, making her decision. We shouldn't let him fall. Can you fix it? Ruby's voice was hopeful. Can you tell Mr. Wyatt to come back? Grace looked at her daughter, really looked at her. The physical injuries were healing, but Ruby's spirit was fading. No amount of surgery or medication could fix a broken heart. And Grace had broken both their hearts by pushing away the people who'd shown them genuine care. I'm going to try, Grace promised. I'm going to try really hard. Ruby smiled for the first time in days, then drifted back to sleep with Buddy clutched to her chest. Grace sat in the darkness making plans. Tomorrow she would go to that garage. Tomorrow she would find Wyatt and his brothers. Tomorrow she would choose her daughter's happiness over the town's approval. It was, she realized, the easiest decision she'd ever made. The morning sun was just breaking over the horizon when Grace pulled up to Miller's auto shop. The parking lot was empty except for one motorcycle. Wyatt's. She recognized the dents in the gas tank. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. She'd left Ruby with Molly, who'd arrived at the hospital at 5 in the morning without complaint when Grace had called. "About time," Molly had said simply, and Grace had seen approval in her old boss's eyes. The garage door was open. Inside, she could see Wyatt bent over an engine, his back to her. Even from here, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he moved more stiffly than usual. His back, the injury he'd put off treating to help Ruby. Grace got out of the car and walked toward the garage. Her footsteps on the gravel made Wyatt turn. His face went through several emotions when he saw her: surprise, hope, caution, resignation. "Grace," he said, wiping his hands on a rag, "is Ruby okay?" "No," Grace said honestly, "she's not." Wyatt's face paled. "What happened? Is she—" "She's physically fine, but she's not eating, not participating in therapy, not talking." Grace took a breath. "She asked me if she did something wrong, if that's why you don't want to see her anymore." Wyatt closed his eyes, pain written across his features. "I was wrong," Grace continued, the words tumbling out now. "I let fear control me. I let other people's opinions matter more than what I knew was true. You've never been anything but kind to us, and I repaid that kindness by asking you to stay away." "You were protecting your daughter," Wyatt said. "I understand." "No," Grace interrupted. "I was protecting myself. From judgment, from gossip, from having to explain to people why I let a Hell's Angel near my daughter." She shook her head. "But Ruby doesn't care about any of that. She just knows that someone who made her smile is gone, and she thinks it's her fault." Wyatt's jaw worked. "What about CPS? The sheriff's investigation?" "Let them investigate," Grace said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "Let them judge. My daughter's happiness is worth more than their approval." For a long moment they stood in silence. Then Vince's voice came from the back of the garage. "She's right, brother. You've been given a second chance. Don't waste it." Grace turned to see Vince, Dex, and 3 other men she recognized from the hospital emerging from the back room. They must have been listening. "She came all the way down here at 6 in the morning, Dex added. "That ought to count for something." Wyatt looked at Grace, really looked at her. "Are you sure once I come back, once we're part of your life, the whole town is gonna know?" "There's no hiding it." "Good," Grace said. "Let them see." A slow smile spread across Wyatt's weathered face. "Yeah, yeah, come home, Wyatt. Ruby's waiting." 2 days later, Grace stood in her small kitchen, stirring a pot of spaghetti sauce and second-guessing every decision that had led to this moment. The table was set for 8, her mismatched plates looking humble but clean. The tablecloth she'd borrowed from Mrs. Perez covering the scars and water rings on the wood. Ruby sat in her wheelchair by the window, watching the street with barely contained excitement. "Are they really coming, Mom?" "Yes, honey, Mr. Wyatt and some of his friends." "And Finn, and Finn." The rumble came first, a deep, thundering sound that made the windows vibrate. Grace peeked through the curtain to see 3 motorcycles pulling up to her curb. Wyatt was in the lead, Finn sitting in front of him wearing a tiny helmet. Behind him were Vince and Dex. "They're here," Ruby squealed, trying to wheel herself toward the door. Grace wiped her hands on her apron and opened the front door before they could knock. Wyatt stood on her porch looking uncomfortable in clean jeans and a button-down shirt. His leather vest was nowhere in sight. Finn bounced excitedly beside him, and behind them, Vince and Dex looked equally out of place in their cleaned-up clothes. Evening, Wyatt said, holding out a bouquet of wildflowers. These are from Finn. The little boy beamed. I picked them myself. They're beautiful, Grace said, genuinely touched. Please come in. The men entered cautiously as if afraid they might break something. Their large frames made Grace's small living room feel even smaller. But Ruby's face lit up like Christmas morning when she saw them. Mr. Wyatt, she called. You came back. Wyatt's smile transformed his face. I told you I'd finish that dinosaur story, didn't I? Yes, Ruby wheeled herself closer. And this is our house. It's small, but it's nice. It's perfect, Wyatt said, kneeling down to her eye level. Just perfect. Dinner was chaotic in the best possible way. Finn and Ruby giggled together over their spaghetti-making slurping contest with the noodles. Vince told stories about his days as a carpenter, showing Ruby pictures on his phone of furniture he'd built. Dex did magic tricks with dinner rolls that had even Grace laughing. And Wyatt watched it all with an expression Grace was coming to recognize. Not quite happiness, but something close. Peace, maybe. A kind of contentment she suspected he hadn't felt in a very long time. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Ruby insisted on showing the men her collection of drawings, most of them get-well cards from her classmates, but a few she'd done herself in the hospital. Finn added his own drawings to the display, and soon the floor was covered with colorful papers. Grace was bringing out dessert apple pie she'd stayed up late baking when there was a knock at the door. She froze. Through the front window, she could see Sheriff Parker's patrol car parked across the street. Wyatt stood immediately, his body language shifting to something more protective. Stay here, he said quietly. But Grace shook her head. No, this is my house. She walked to the door and opened it. Sheriff Parker stood on her porch, hat in hand. Behind him, Grace could see curtains twitching in windows across the street. The whole neighborhood was watching. Evening, Grace, the sheriff said. His eyes moved past her to take in the scene inside the bikers, the children, the evidence of a family dinner. Sheriff, Grace said, her voice steady. Is there a problem? No problem. He shifted uncomfortably. I came to apologize, actually. Grace blinked in surprise. Apologize? My deputy, young Thompson, he did some digging. Real digging, not just looking at old arrest records. Sheriff Parker pulled a folder from under his arm. Turns out the Hells Angels chapter in this county has a pretty impressive record. They've sponsored 3 youth sports teams. They do an annual toy drive for the Children's Hospital. Last year, they raised $15,000 for the domestic violence shelter. He opened the folder showing Grace newspaper clippings she'd never seen. And Wyatt Thorne. He didn't get kicked out of his job. He quit after his family died, and the fire chief wrote him a letter of recommendation calling him one of the finest paramedics in the state. He looked past Grace to where Wyatt stood. I'm sorry I didn't look deeper before making accusations. Wyatt stepped forward, coming to stand beside Grace. Apology accepted, Sheriff. And the investigation, Grace asked. Closed before it began. There's nothing to investigate, just some good people helping a family in need. Sheriff Parker put his hat back on. I'll make sure CPS knows the same. After he left, Grace closed the door and leaned against it, her legs suddenly weak. Through the window, she saw Sheriff Parker stop to talk to Mrs. Henderson, who was standing in her yard, obviously trying to see what was happening. They spoke for a few minutes, and Grace saw the older woman's expression change from concern to surprise to something that might have been shame. Did that really just happen? Grace asked. Wyatt grinned. Small towns. Word travels fast, bad and good. They returned to the living room where Ruby and Finn had built a fort out of couch cushions and were having a battle with stuffed animals. The bikers had settled back into their seats, looking considerably more relaxed. So, Vince said, accepting a slice of pie from Grace. What now? Grace looked around her living room at the rough men eating pie, at the children playing at Wyatt, standing in her kitchen doorway, looking more at home than she'd ever seen him. Now we figure out what comes next, she said, together. As the evening wound down and the guests prepared to leave, Ruby threw her arms around Wyatt's neck. You're coming back tomorrow, right? If your mom says it's okay, I'll be there. Ruby looked at Grace with pleading eyes. He can come anytime, Grace said softly. At the door, Wyatt paused. Thank you, he said to Grace, for giving us another chance. Thank you for not giving up on us, Grace replied. After they left, Grace carried a sleepy Ruby to bed. As she tucked her daughter in, Ruby smiled up at her. Today was the best day since the accident, Mom. Yeah, baby, it really was. Grace turned off the light and went back to the kitchen to clean up. Through the window, she could see motorcycle taillights disappearing down the street. Tomorrow, she knew the town would be buzzing with news of the sheriff's visit of the bikers at her dinner table. Some people would judge, some would gossip, but some she hoped might start to see what she had finally allowed herself to see. That sometimes the people who look the most dangerous are the ones with the kindest hearts. That family isn't always about blood. And that grace, real grace, comes from the most unexpected places. The morning sun cast long shadows across the physical therapy room at County General Hospital. 2 weeks had passed since the dinner at Grace's house, and the change in Ruby was remarkable. Where before she had been listless and withdrawn, now she attacked her therapy sessions with fierce determination. 5 more steps, Ruby, encouraged Maria, the physical therapist. You can do it. Ruby gripped the parallel bars, her small face set with concentration. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she lifted her casted leg and moved it forward. 1 step, 2, 3. Her arms trembled with effort, but she didn't stop. 4, 5. Excellent, Maria clapped. That's the best you've done all week. Ruby beamed, looking toward the observation window where Grace stood watching. But her smile grew even wider when she saw who was standing beside her mother. Wyatt raised his hand in a small wave, and Ruby waved back enthusiastically, nearly losing her balance before Maria steadied her. Someone's got a cheering section, Maria said with a knowing smile. After the session, Wyatt met them in the hallway. He'd brought his now customary gift today. It was a book about a girl who tamed wild horses. For later, he said, handing it to Ruby as Grace wheeled her back toward her room. When you're resting. Will you read it to me? Ruby asked hopefully. Have to head out for a club run this afternoon, Wyatt said, and Ruby's face fell slightly. But I'll be back tomorrow, and I hear someone special is visiting today. Ruby's eyes widened. Who? Your teacher, Mrs. Patterson, and some of your classmates. Grace watched this exchange with a feeling she was still getting used to contentment. The past 2 weeks had fallen into a comfortable rhythm. Wyatt visited every afternoon, sometimes with Finn, sometimes alone. Other members of the club rotated through Vince, teaching Ruby to play chess, Dex doing card tricks, Tommy bringing origami paper, and showing her how to make cranes. The town's reaction had been mixed. Some people, like Sheriff Parker and Mrs. Henderson, had quietly revised their opinions. Others still crossed the street when they saw the motorcycles parked at the hospital. But Grace found she cared less and less about their judgments. What mattered was Ruby's progress. And Ruby was thriving. That afternoon, Ruby's hospital room filled with visitors. Mrs. Patterson, her second-grade teacher, brought cards from all 23 students in Ruby's class. 5 of her closest friends came too wide-eyed at the hospital equipment, but excited to see Ruby. Does it hurt? Asked Sophie Barnes, Ruby's best friend. Not so much anymore, Ruby said. Look, You can sign my cast." The girls took turns writing their names in colorful markers, filling the white plaster with hearts and flowers and messages of "get well soon." Grace stood back watching her daughter laugh and chat with her friends and felt tears prick her eyes. This was the Ruby she knew, bright, social, full of life. Later, after the visitors had left and Ruby was napping, Dr. Bennett stopped by for his evening rounds. "Remarkable progress," he said, reviewing Ruby's chart. "Her vitals are excellent, pain levels are down, and she's exceeding all our physical therapy goals." He looked at Grace over his glasses. "Whatever changed 2 weeks ago, keep doing it." Grace thought about Wyatt reading stories about the bikers bringing laughter back into Ruby's life. "I will," she promised. That evening, as Grace was getting ready to leave for a quick trip on to shower and change, Nurse Patty pulled her aside. "There's been some talk," Patty said quietly. "Good talk about what the motorcycle club did for you and Ruby." She smiled. "The hospital auxiliary wants to do a feature in the newsletter about community support during medical crises. They want to mention what happened with your permission, of course." Grace was surprised. "The hospital wants to highlight the Hells Angels." "Times are changing," Patty said. "People are starting to see what I've known all along, that Wyatt and his brothers are good men." The next day, Grace arrived at the hospital to find a small crowd gathered in Ruby's room. Wyatt was there with Vince and Dex, but so were Mayor Thompson, Dr. Morrison, and several nurses Grace recognized. "What's going on?" Grace asked, concerned. Mayor Thompson stepped forward, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Ms. Mitchell, I wanted to come personally to apologize for the town meeting. I let fear and prejudice cloud my judgment." He turned to Wyatt. "And I wanted to invite you and your club to join our new town safety council. We're looking at that intersection where the accident happened, putting in better crosswalks, speed bumps, warning signs. Your input would be valuable." Wyatt looked stunned. "You want us on the council?" "If you're willing," the mayor said. "Seems to me we've been looking at you fellows all wrong." After they left, Wyatt sank into the chair beside Ruby's bed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Did that really just happen?" "Things are changing," Grace said softly. "Because of Ruby," Wyatt said, looking at the little girl who was coloring contentedly in her bed. "She changed everything." The next 2 weeks brought more changes. The local newspaper ran a story about Ruby's recovery, mentioning the community support that had helped the family. While the Hells Angels weren't named directly, everyone in town knew who the article was referring to. Grace noticed the shifts in small ways. Mrs. Henderson waved from across the street instead of looking away. The pharmacist asked after Ruby without the previous undertone of concern about those bikers. Even Frank Barton had nodded to her in the grocery store. But the biggest change was in Ruby herself. Her doctors were amazed at her progress. The stitches came out of her forehead, leaving only a faint pink line that would fade with time. Her leg was healing ahead of schedule, and her spirit that had healed most of all. 3 weeks after the dinner at Grace's house, Dr. Bennett called Grace into a consultation room. "I want to try something," he said. "Ruby's been doing so well with the walker and crutches. I think she might be ready to try walking without any support." Grace's heart leaped. "Really? But it's only been 5 weeks. It's the accident." "I know, it's remarkable. But children heal fast, and Ruby's determination is exceptional." He paused. "I'd like to schedule a session for this Saturday. Would that work?" Grace thought about it. "Saturday. Can I invite some people for moral support?" "Of course. Family is always welcome." That evening, Grace told Ruby about the plan. The little girl's eyes went wide. "Walk by myself like before." "The doctor thinks you're ready to train." Ruby bit her lip, a gesture she made when she was nervous. "What if I can't?" Then you keep practicing until you can, Grace said. But I have a feeling you're going to surprise everyone. That night, Grace called Wyatt. They've been talking on the phone most evenings now. Brief conversations after Ruby fell asleep. Sometimes about Ruby, sometimes about other things. Grace found herself looking forward to his deep voice, to the way he listened when she talked about her worries and dreams. Saturday, she said when he answered, Ruby's gonna try walking without support. I know it's a lot to ask, but I'll be there, Wyatt said immediately. Should I bring the brothers? Please. Ruby would love that. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright. Grace helped Ruby dress in comfortable clothes, the purple unicorn shirt Wyatt had given her, and soft pants with one leg cut to fit over the cast. Ruby was unusually quiet, her nervousness evident. What if I fall? She asked as Grace brushed her hair. Then Mr. Wyatt will catch you, Grace said. And so will I. You're not alone in this, baby. At the hospital, the physical therapy room had been transformed. Balloons decorated one corner, Finn's contribution, Grace learned. A banner reading Go Ruby hung on the wall, clearly made by the bikers. The letters were uneven but enthusiastic. And the room was full. Grace hadn't expected so many people. Wyatt and Finn, of course. Vince, Dex, Tommy Bones, and Ricky from the club. Molly from the diner. Mrs. Patterson and three of Ruby's classmates. Nurse Patty and several other hospital staff members. Even Sheriff Parker had shown up, standing quietly in the back. Ruby's eyes went wide when she saw everyone. Are all these people here for me? Every single one, Grace said, squeezing her daughter's hand. Maria, the physical therapist, positioned Ruby's wheelchair at one end of the padded walkway. Okay, Ruby, today we're going to try something new. No walker, no crutches, just you and your own 2 feet. You ready? Ruby looked at the distance, maybe 12 feet, to where Dr. Bennett stood at the other end. It might as well have been a mile. Her small face was pale, her hands gripping the wheelchair arms. Wyatt knelt down beside her, his large frame somehow making Ruby seem even smaller. Hey, kiddo, you know what I see when I look at you. Ruby shook her head. I see the bravest person I've ever met. You ran into traffic to save Finn. You've done every single therapy exercise, even when it hurt. You got through surgery and hospitals and all kinds of scary stuff. His voice was gentle but firm. Walking 12 feet, that's nothing compared to what you've already done. But what if I can't? Ruby whispered. Then you try again tomorrow, Wyatt said. But I think you're going to surprise yourself. I think you're going to flee. Ruby took a deep breath. Okay, I'm ready. Grace helped her daughter stand, keeping her hands lightly on Ruby's arms for balance. Ruby's good leg took her weight easily, but the injured leg, the one that had been broken in 2 places, trembled visibly. You've got this, Grace whispered. Ruby let go of her mother's hands. For a moment she stood there swaying slightly, her arms stretched out for balance. The room held its collective breath. Then Ruby took a step. Her good leg moved forward smoothly. The injured leg followed, bearing her weight for just a second before she shifted to the other foot. It was awkward, her gait uneven, but she was moving, walking, doing it on her own. Step 2, step 3. That's it, Ruby, Finn called out. You're doing it. Step 4. Ruby's face was set with fierce concentration, her tongue poking out slightly, the way it did when she was drawing. Step 5. 6. She was halfway there. Come on, princess, Wyatt said softly. Step 7. 8. Ruby wobbled and Grace started to move forward, but Wyatt caught her arm. Let her, he murmured. She's got it. And Ruby did. She steadied herself, took a breath, and kept going. Step 9, 10, 11. Dr. Bennett knelt down at the end of the walkway, his arms open. One more, Ruby. Just one more. Step 12. Ruby reached Dr. Bennett and collapsed into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. The room erupted in cheers. The bikers whooped and hollered. Finn jumped up and down. Nurse Patty wiped tears from her eyes. Grace ran to her daughter, dropping to her knees to wrap Ruby in a hug. You did it, baby. You did it. But Ruby was looking past her mother to where Wyatt stood, his weathered face streaked with tears. Did you see Mr. Wyatt? I flew. Wyatt crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt beside them, pulling both Grace and Ruby into his arms. You flew, princess, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You absolutely flew. Grace felt his tears on her shoulder, felt his large frame shaking with sobs he'd probably been holding back for 5 years. This wasn't just about Ruby walking. This was about a man who'd failed to save his own daughter, watching another little girl accomplish the impossible. This was about redemption and second chances and the healing power of a child's courage. When they finally pulled apart, Ruby reached up and touched Wyatt's wet cheek. Don't cry, Mr. Wyatt. Happy tears, remember, like Mom has. Wyatt laughed through his tears. Yeah, kiddo, the happiest tears ever. Around them, people clapped and hugged and celebrated. Vince was openly crying, not bothering to hide it. Dex was on the phone, probably calling other club members to spread the news. The children danced around, caught up in the joy of the moment. And Grace stood in the middle of it all, her daughter safe in her arms, surrounded by people who had become family in the most unexpected way, and felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Pure, uncomplicated hope for the future. The day of Ruby's discharge arrived 2 weeks later. Grace had been planning for this moment. She'd rearranged the furniture at home to accommodate the wheelchair. Though Ruby was walking short distances, now set up a little recovery station in Ruby's bedroom with everything she might need, and prepared Ruby's favorite meals to have ready in the freezer. But she hadn't expected the send-off. As she helped Ruby get dressed in regular clothes, jeans with one leg cut to fit over the walking boot that had replaced the heavy cast, Nurse Patty came in with a huge smile. Someone's waiting to escort you home, she said mysteriously. Grace and Ruby made their way through the hospital corridors, saying goodbye to nurses and staff who had become familiar faces over the past 7 weeks. Everyone hugged Ruby, gave her little gifts, made her promise to visit. At the main entrance, the automatic doors slid open and Ruby gasped. Stretched along the hospital driveway was a line of motorcycles. Grace counted quickly, 18 of them gleaming in the morning sun. The riders stood behind their bikes, all wearing their leather vests with the Hells Angels insignia. But today the vests looked less intimidating and more like uniforms of honor. Wyatt stood at the front holding a small helmet, purple with unicorns painted on the sides. Welcome home, princess, he called, his voice warm. Ruby's face split into the biggest smile Grace had seen since before the accident. Are those all for me? We're your escort, Vince said, stepping forward. Can't have our girl going home with a proper fanfare. Wyatt approached with the helmet. Special order. Thought you might want to ride with me if your mom says it's okay. Grace looked at her daughter's eager face, then at Wyatt's hopeful expression. The old Grace, the one from 2 months ago, would have said no immediately. Too dangerous, too fast, too much, but that Grace had learned a lot about what real danger looked like and what real safety felt like. Okay, she said, but you take it slow. Promise, Wyatt said solemnly. He helped Ruby onto his motorcycle, settling her carefully in front of him, where she'd be protected by his larger frame. He fastened the helmet under her chin, then put on his own. Finn, Grace noticed, was riding with Vince, already looking like a seasoned biker in his little helmet. We'll follow in the car, Grace said, fighting back tears. Her baby looked so small on that big motorcycle, but so happy. The procession started slowly. Wyatt led with Ruby sitting proud and beaming in front of him. The other motorcycles fell into formation behind them, creating a thunder of engines that echoed off the buildings. Grace followed in her old sedan, watching her daughter's ponytail stream out behind her as they rode. They took the long way through town down Main Street instead of the highway, and as they rode, something remarkable happened. People came out of shops and houses. They lined the sidewalks, clapping and waving. Grace saw Mrs. Henderson on her porch, hands clasped to her chest, tears on her face. Frank Barton stood outside his hardware store giving a thumbs up. The mayor stood on the town hall steps with several council members, all of them applauding. Someone had put up a banner across Main Street, "Welcome home, Ruby." Ruby waved at everyone like a parade queen. Her joy infectious. The little girl who'd almost died on this very street was coming home triumphant, escorted by the men the town had feared, celebrated by a community that had learned to see past its prejudices. Grace's vision blurred with tears as she drove. This was more than just Ruby coming home from the hospital. This was healing for Ruby, for Wyatt, for the whole town. This was what happened when people chose love over fear, acceptance over judgment. When they reached Grace's street, more surprises awaited. The neighborhood had decorated. Balloons and streamers adorned the trees. A welcome home. Ruby sign hung on the fence. And the yard was full of people. Molly from the diner was there along with half the staff. Ruby's teacher and several classmates. Neighbors who'd kept their distance before. And in the middle of it all, a long table covered with food, clearly a potluck where everyone had contributed. The motorcycles pulled up to the curb and shut off their engines. Wyatt helped Ruby down carefully, and she was immediately surrounded by friends and neighbors wanting to hug her and welcome her home. Grace parked and got out, overwhelmed by the scene. Molly came over and pulled her into a hug. "Town decided to throw her a proper welcome home party," Molly said. "Hope that's okay." "It's perfect," Grace managed through her tears. The afternoon unfolded like a dream. Ruby held court from a comfortable chair in the yard, telling stories about the hospital and showing off her walking skills. She took a few wobbly steps across the lawn, and everyone cheered as if she'd won the Olympics. The bikers mingled easily with the townspeople now. Grace watched Vince discussing carpentry with Frank Barton, saw Dex teaching a group of kids card tricks, noticed Tommy helping Mrs. Henderson carry her casserole dish to the food table. And Wyatt stayed close to Ruby, but his eyes kept finding Grace across the yard. Each time their gazes met, Grace felt something warm unfold in her chest. Something that had been growing quietly over the past weeks, nurtured by late-night phone calls and shared laughter and moments of connection. As the afternoon wore into evening and people began to leave, Wyatt helped Grace carry Ruby inside. The little girl was exhausted but happy, chattering about the party even as her eyelids drooped. "Best day ever," Ruby mumbled as Grace tucked her into her own bed for the first time in 7 weeks. "Even better than the hospital." Grace kissed her forehead. "Sweet dreams, brave girl." Ruby was asleep before Grace turned off the light. Downstairs, Wyatt was cleaning up the last of the party supplies. Grace found him in the kitchen, drying dishes. "You don't have to do that," she said. "Want to," he replied simply. They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Then Wyatt spoke. "I've been thinking," he started, then paused. "About the future, about what comes next." Grace's heart beat faster. "Yeah, I want to be in Ruby's life, in your life, if you'll have me." He set down the dish he was drying and turned to face her fully. Not as someone passing through or just checking in, but really in it for the long haul. Grace looked at this man who'd come into their lives through tragedy and stayed through choice, who'd read stories and held vigils and sold his possessions to help a child he barely knew, who'd shown her that family wasn't about blood or convention, but about showing up and staying present and choosing each other every day. "I'd like that," she said softly. "We'd both like that." Wyatt smiled a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look younger, less burdened. "Yeah, yeah." He crossed the kitchen and took her hands in his. "I can't promise it'll be easy. The club, the town, all of it, there'll be challenges." "I'm not afraid of challenges," Grace said. "Not anymore." "No," Wyatt agreed, bringing her hands to his lips and kissing them gently. "I don't suppose you are." They stood like that for a long moment, the kitchen quiet around them, the weight of the past 2 months settling into something lighter, something that felt like possibility. Upstairs, Ruby slept peacefully in her own bed, safe and healing and loved. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, the party decorations swaying gently in the evening breeze. And in Grace's small kitchen, two broken people who'd found each other through the bravery of a 6-year-old girl began to believe that maybe, just maybe, second chances were real. 3 months later, autumn had painted the town in shades of gold and crimson. Grace stood in her backyard watching as Ruby actually ran across the grass with Finn, both children shrieking with laughter as they chased fallen leaves. "Mom, watch this," Ruby called, then demonstrated a cartwheel that was only slightly crooked. Grace applauded, her heart full. The doctors had been right. Children healed remarkably fast. Ruby's leg was completely healed now, with only a thin white scar to show where the break had been. The scar on her forehead had faded to a barely visible line. But more than the physical healing, Ruby's spirit had grown. She was more confident now, more aware of her own strength. The backyard was full of people, a regular occurrence these days. Molly stood by the grill supervising as Vince flipped burgers. Dex was teaching a group of neighborhood kids how to juggle. Tommy and Bones had set up a horseshoe pit and were engaged in a fierce competition with Frank Barton and Sheriff Parker. Grace smiled, watching the impossible scene. 3 months ago, she never would have believed this could be her life. Wyatt came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She leaned back against his chest, feeling safe and cherished in a way she'd never experienced before. "Penny for your thoughts," he murmured. "Just thinking about how much has changed," Grace said. "How different everything is now. Better different. So much better." Ruby ran over Finn close behind. "Uncle Wyatt, can we have a bonfire tonight, please?" Uncle Wyatt had become Ruby's preferred title about a month ago, though Grace suspected Ruby was hoping it might change to something else eventually. The little girl had become an expert at making pointed comments about how nice it would be to have a real family and asking when people usually got married. "I think a bonfire sounds perfect," Wyatt said, "if it's okay with your mom." "It's okay with me," Grace said, ruffling Ruby's hair. The children shined off again, and Grace turned in Wyatt's arms to face him. "She asked me this morning when you were going to propose." Wyatt's eyes widened, then crinkled with amusement. "Did she now?" "Apparently, Finn told her that you've been acting weird and looking at jewelry stores." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Is that true?" Wyatt had the grace to look sheepish. "Might have done some window shopping." "Wyatt Thorne, are you planning to propose to me?" "Was planning to make it more romantic than this," he admitted. "Maybe take you to that nice restaurant in the next town over. Do it proper." Grace thought about it, about fancy restaurants and planned proposals. Then she thought about her life, about how nothing had gone according to plan, but had worked out better than she could have imagined. Or, she said slowly, you could do it right here, right now, surrounded by family. Because that's what these people were. The bikers who'd become uncles to Ruby, the neighbors who'd learned to see past fear, the children playing in her yard, the community that had come together. Wyatt searched her face. You sure? I've never been more sure of anything. He took a breath and called out, Hey, everyone, can I have your attention for a minute? The yard gradually quieted. People turned to look. Ruby's eyes went wide. She knew what was happening. Finn started bouncing excitedly. Wyatt took Grace's hands. I had a whole speech planned, he said, but I'm going to keep this simple. He looked into her eyes. 5 months ago, I was going through life feeling half dead. I'd lost everything that mattered, and I didn't think I'd ever feel whole again. Then a brave little girl saved my son's life, and in the process, she saved mine too. Grace felt tears starting to flow. You and Ruby, you brought me back to life. You showed me that family isn't just about blood. It's about showing up. It's about choosing each other every single day. It's about second chances and new beginnings. He paused. Grace Mitchell, will you marry me? Yes, Grace said without hesitation. Yes, absolutely yes. Wyatt picked her up and spun her around while the backyard erupted in cheers. Ruby was jumping up and down, screaming, I'm getting a date, I'm getting a date. Finn was celebrating with her. The bikers were clapping and hollering. Even Frank Barton was wiping at his eyes. When Wyatt set Grace down, he pulled a small box from his pocket. Was gonna save this for the fancy restaurant, he said, but seems like now is the right time. The ring was perfect, simple, elegant, with a small diamond that caught the light. As he slid it onto her finger, Grace thought about the journey that had brought them here. The accident, the hospital, the fear and the healing, the town's transformation. All of it had led to this moment. Ruby ran over and launched herself at both of them, wrapping her small arms around their legs. We're going to be a real family. We already are, kiddo, Wyatt said, scooping her up. The ring is just making it official. As the sun set over the celebration, Grace stood surrounded by her family, the one she'd been born into and the one she'd chosen, and felt a peace she'd never known before. Ruby was healed and happy. Wyatt had found his second chance. The town had learned that love could bridge any divide. She thought about that terrifying afternoon 5 months ago, when her daughter had lain broken on the pavement and Grace's whole world had fallen apart. If someone had told her then that it would lead to this beautiful, chaotic, loving family, she never would have believed it. But here they were, proof that sometimes the worst moments lead to the best outcomes. That sometimes angels wear leather jackets. That sometimes salvation comes on two wheels. Ruby pulled on her sleeve. Mom, I made something for you and Uncle Wyatt. She held out a drawing, a new one different from the ones she'd made before. This one showed a house with 4 stick figures standing in front, a woman, a man, and 2 children. All of them were holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Written across the top in Ruby's careful printing were the words, My family. Grace took the drawing with trembling hands, then pulled her daughter close. Wyatt wrapped his arms around them both, creating a circle of warmth and safety and love. Perfect, Grace whispered, looking at the drawing. It's absolutely perfect. As the bonfire was lit and the stars began to appear, the celebration continued. Stories were told, laughter rang out, and a community that had been divided by fear came together in joy. And in the middle of it all, a little girl who'd almost lost everything danced in the firelight, her laughter a testament to the resilience of children and the healing power of love. 3 months ago, Ruby Mitchell had saved a boy's life and nearly lost her own. Tonight she stood whole and happy, surrounded by a family forged in tragedy and strengthened by choice. She'd given a broken man a reason to heal. She'd given a frightened mother the courage to trust. She'd given a fearful town the chance to learn that love was stronger than prejudice. Sometimes it takes a child to teach adults what really matters. Sometimes it takes tragedy to reveal true character. Sometimes it takes losing everything to find what you were meant to have all along. As the fire crackled and the stars wheeled overhead, Grace leaned against Wyatt's shoulder and watched her daughter play. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, wedding planning, combining households, navigating the future as a blended family. But tonight was perfect. Tonight was everything. And it all started with a brave little girl who ran toward danger instead of away from it, who saw someone who needed help and didn't hesitate, who changed the course of multiple lives with a single selfless act. Ruby had taught them all that real heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing what's right anyway. And real family isn't about who you're born to. It's about who you choose and who chooses you back every single day.